June 11, 1997. The Delta Center, Salt Lake City, Utah. 7 o'clock in the evening, Mountain Time. The arena had been open since 5, and the 19,911 people who held tickets had been filling their seats with the particular velocity of a crowd that understood the occasion was not ordinary. Salt Lake City in June of 1997 was not a basketball city in the way Chicago was a basketball city. Not yet. Not by the measurement of decades and dynasties and the accumulated civic identity that championship sports franchises produce in cities over time. But the Utah Jazz had done something in the preceding years that had produced in the local population a ferocity of investment that was, if anything, more intense than the detached expertise of cities that had seen championships many times before. The Delta Center had been opened in 1991, and in the 6 years of its existence, it had become one of the most hostile environments in professional basketball for visiting teams, a building where the crowd noise operated at a frequency and consistency that visiting players described afterward, in terms that suggested they were comparing notes on a natural phenomenon rather than an audience. The seats in the lower bowl were close to the floor, closer than in most NBA arenas of the period, and the effect of this was that the crowd's noise arrived at the players not from a distance but from directly beside them, a wall of sound on all 4 sides that had no quiet edge. The Jazz had won games 3 and 4 at the Delta Center and had come into this series, the 1997 NBA Finals, Utah Jazz versus Chicago Bulls, as a franchise that had never won a championship and had spent 2 decades assembling the specific pieces required to compete for one. They had Karl Malone, the power forward from Summerfield, Louisiana, who had just won his first Most Valuable Player award over Michael Jordan by 986 points to 957, who stood 6 feet and 9 inches and weighed 259 pounds, and had spent 13 seasons turning himself into the most physically dominant post player in the game. They had John Stockton at point guard, 6 feet and 1 inch, 175 pounds, 11 consecutive all-defensive team selections, the all-time assists leader, a man whose specific basketball intelligence was so far ahead of the analytical frameworks available to describe it that most observers defaulted to vague celebrations of his fundamentals rather than attempting to articulate what he actually did. They had Jerry Sloan coaching, a man from McLeansboro, Illinois, who had spent 12 years at the helm of the Jazz franchise, running a system of such mechanical consistency that opposing coaches spent weeks in advance studying its execution and still found themselves unable to adequately counter it in real time. The Jazz had gone 64-18 in the regular season. They had gone 10-0 at home in the playoffs before this game. The Delta Center crowd on the night of June 11th understood all of this and had arranged itself in the building accordingly, not with the nervous energy of a fan base that hoped its team would win, but with the settled certainty of people who had come to witness a specific outcome and expected to receive it. Karl Malone was 33 years old, and the 1996 to 1997 season had been the fullest expression of what he was. He had averaged 27 points and 9.9 rebounds per game across the regular season, numbers that represented not only elite production, but elite production achieved through a specific physical methodology that Malone had been developing since his first season in the league in 1985. He had come into the league at 245 pounds, and through a weight training program of near-obsessive commitment, had added 14 more pounds of functional muscle over his career, until the body that took the floor in the 1997 finals was, by any available physical measurement, one of the most powerful offensive weapons the game had produced at his position. He had been named the most valuable player in February at the All-Star Game, where the hardware was formally delivered. The speech he gave thanked Jordan for lending him the award for 1 year. It was a gracious speech, funny in the way that gracious speeches sometimes are, and it was also a statement of competitive position. Malone understood that the award was a single season's judgment, that Jordan had won it 8 times before him and would be attempting to reclaim it in the following season, and that the most complete version of the contest between them would be played in June on the floor without a voting committee. The Jazz had arranged their entire playoff preparation around the premise that this was their moment, that Malone's age and physical peak coincided with the specific window available to a franchise that had been building toward a championship for 2 decades, that Jordan was 33 years old himself, and playing for a coach who had announced this would be his final season on the Chicago bench, and that the combination of these circumstances produced in the summer of 1997 a rare atmospheric alignment in which a team built around a player who was not Michael Jordan had legitimate grounds to believe it could win a championship. On the evening of June 11th, with the series tied at 2 games apiece, with the Delta Center crowd in full voice, with the Jazz 10-0 at home in the playoffs, and the Bulls arriving with a problem their coaching staff had been managing since 2 o'clock in the morning and had not been able to solve, the argument that Utah's moment had arrived was not unreasonable. The problem the Bulls' coaching staff had been managing was Michael Jordan's condition. It had begun around midnight on June 10th in Jordan's room at the team's hotel in Park City, Utah. He had ordered a pizza. Room service had stopped at 9 o'clock and he had been hungry, and the pizza place was the option available. And the pizza had arrived with 5 delivery men, and Tim Grover, Jordan's trainer, who had been in the room when it arrived, had told the documentary record years later that he'd had a bad feeling the moment they walked in. Jordan had been the only person in the room who ate. By 2 in the morning, he had collapsed in the fetal position on the floor of his room, shaking, his body producing the full catalogue of responses that severe food poisoning produces in a body that is otherwise operating at the extreme upper range of human physical conditioning. Grover had assessed the situation and diagnosed food poisoning rather than flu, the distinction mattering less than the shared effect. Complete debilitation of a person who was scheduled to play the most important basketball game of the season in approximately 17 hours. IV fluids were administered in the hotel room. Jordan removed the IV at some point in the early morning because he was preparing for the game. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had not attended the team's morning shoot-around. He had arrived at the Delta Center at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 hours before tip-off, and gone directly to a back room where he spent the pre-game period in near darkness, the lights low, his body attempting some version of recovery that the timeline and the situation did not permit. Phil Jackson came to check on him. Jordan told Jackson he was ready to play. Jackson recorded later that Jordan looked gaunt and unsteady, that the person who emerged from the back room and took the court for warm-ups was visibly operating at a level below what the game required, and that the decision to start him was made on the understanding that Jordan's assessment of his own capacity to function was more reliable than anyone else's assessment of it, even on nights like this one. The arena crowd did not know most of this when they took their seats. They knew he had been reported as ill. The broadcasts had mentioned flu-like symptoms. What the crowd understood, in the efficient way that playoff crowds process information about opponents, was that the best player in the world was sick, that the Jazz were at home, that the series was tied, and that the perfect 10-0 home record in the playoffs extended back through the entirety of this postseason. They had taken their seats with this information arranged in the correct order, and by the time the starting lineups were announced, the Delta Center had reached its standard operating volume, which was loud, and when Jordan's name was read, number 23, Michael Jordan, the sound that arrived in his direction was not a polite acknowledgement of a great player's presence on the opponent's roster. It was a comprehensive rejection, organized and sustained. The sound of 19,000 people communicating simultaneously that the visiting team's best player was not welcome here, that whatever he had accomplished on other floors, in other buildings, was not relevant to what was about to happen on this one. Jordan stood at the free throw line during the introductions and watched the Jazz players receive their ovations, with an expression that had absorbed that kind of crowd communication so many times it had ceased to require processing. He had been booed in every road arena of consequence during his career. He had been booed in the Boston Garden and in Madison Square Garden, and in every building in the league where the home crowd understood that the presence of Michael Jordan on the visitors' side of the ledger was sufficient cause to generate opposition. He had learned through repetition across 13 seasons to convert the sound of crowds booing into something that served him rather than something he had to manage. He had absorbed the booing in Cleveland's Richfield Coliseum in 1989, while the crowd told him to schedule his summer golf tee times, and had responded by hitting the most famous shot of his career to that point. He had absorbed the booing in New York's Madison Square Garden across 4 separate playoff series, and had responded by scoring 54 points in a single game. The sound of a hostile crowd was not new information. It was familiar information, and familiar information for Jordan had a specific function. It entered the same internal ledger as every other slight, every other dismissal, every other public expression of the belief that he could not do what he was about to do. This was different in one respect. This was 19,000 people who had gathered on the specific understanding that a dynasty was ending and a new champion was about to be crowned, who had watched their team go 10-0 at home in these playoffs, who were preparing to celebrate a championship in front of their own crowd, and who were looking at the visiting team's best player and seeing, with the unguarded confidence of people who believe the future they have been imagining is about to arrive, a man who was visibly not himself. The first quarter confirmed their confidence. Jordan appeared weak in a way that was new, in a way that did not look like fatigue from a long season or the controlled conservation of a veteran who was pacing himself for the fourth quarter. He moved differently. His footwork, which was his most reliable physical instrument, was slightly off its axis, the cuts arriving a quarter step late, the changes of direction lacking the quality that defenders had spent years calibrating their responses to. The Jazz went on a run. The lead extended. Utah led 36-20 by the time the first quarter ended, a 16-point margin that the Delta Center crowd received with the specific sound of people for whom the game was proceeding exactly as they had arranged the evening in their imaginations. The chant for Karl Malone went through the building, MVP, the three syllables delivered in rhythm by sections of the crowd that had been organizing this tribute since February and saw no reason to withhold it now. Malone accepted the crowd's offering with the dignified composure of a man who understood that the arena was correct, that the evidence supported the chant, that on this night and in this building he was the most valuable player and his team had the series and the championship within reach. Jordan sat on the bench with a towel over his head. His body language communicated nothing. His teammates, who had watched him function across 3 championship seasons, understood that the towel meant something different on this night than it would have meant on a normal night, that the person under it was managing a physical situation that none of them had seen him manage before, and that the way the game was proceeding made it reasonable to contemplate outcomes that were not part of their normal operational framework. Scottie Pippen, who had played alongside Jordan since 1987 and had developed the most precise available reading of his partner's competitive states, said later that Jordan had been quiet all day, that he had sat in his own world on the bench, and that watching him that night had produced the specific fear that he might at any moment need to leave the floor permanently. That was the first quarter. Something happened in the second quarter. It did not arrive as a declaration or a visible transformation. Jordan did not stand up from the bench and announce himself recovered or deliver a speech to his teammates about what was coming. It arrived as a recalibration, as though some internal measurement instrument had completed its assessment and found that the situation, while serious, had not crossed the threshold that Jordan's body had identified as the line between difficult and impossible. He began making shots, not at his full range of motion, not with the specific elevation and hang time that had defined his offensive game for 13 seasons, but with enough precision and enough competitive intelligence to begin converting possessions. He scored 17 points in the second quarter. The Jazz lead, which had been 16 points, came down to 4 at halftime. The Delta Center crowd continued its noise, but the quality had shifted slightly. The way crowd noise shifts when the thing the crowd has been expecting to happen is taking longer to happen than the timeline the crowd had assumed. The third quarter was Utah's. Jordan sat on the bench through stretches, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, the towel nearby. The Jazz reclaimed their lead. 8 points by the end of the third quarter, and the crowd was back at its full operational register, the MVP chant cycling through the sections that had been performing it since tip-off, Malone taking the ovations with the authority of a man who had spent 13 seasons earning the right to stand at the center of a championship series and be recognized as the reason his team was winning. The Delta Center had spent the entire evening building toward this, the home crowd carrying its team to a championship series lead in the most important game, at home, against the most famous player in the sport. This was the architecture of the evening. The structure was complete. The material was all in place. Jordan went back into the game in the fourth quarter. The Bulls ran their offense through him when he was available, and he was available less than they would have preferred, his body requiring intervals of rest that his competitive instincts refused to acknowledge as rest, and that his trainers acknowledged on his behalf by inserting them into the game plan whether he requested them or not. He scored when he had the ball. He missed some shots he would normally make, and made some he would normally miss, and the pattern of the fourth quarter was not the pattern of a dominant performance. It was the pattern of a man operating a body that was not fully functional and making the decisions that kept his team in proximity to the game's outcome, without destroying the physical equipment required to continue making those decisions in the final minutes. The crowd at the Delta Center had maintained its noise through the fourth quarter, with the specific persistence of a crowd that is watching a lead. It expected to expand, failed to expand, that is watching a visiting team stay competitive in a building where visiting teams were not supposed to stay competitive, and that is converting its anxiety about this into additional volume with the theory that volume is a form of action. When Jordan missed a shot, the building's sound reorganized itself around the miss, registering it as confirmation that the architecture of the evening remained intact. When Jordan made a shot, the building absorbed it with the slightly brittle quality of a crowd absorbing evidence it had not fully prepared to receive. With 2 minutes remaining, the game was tied at 81. John Stockton hit a jumper, a pull-up from the elbow that was the Stockton shot, the one that lived in the muscle memory of 11 All-Star seasons, and Utah led by 2 with 1 minute and 46 seconds on the clock. The Delta Center registered this shot with the appropriate enthusiasm of 19,000 people who understood its significance in the moment's mathematics. Jordan received the ball on the next possession. He drove into the paint, not with the full acceleration that made his drives to the basket events the arena could not adequately prepare for, but with enough controlled directional change to find the angle, the specific lane between Stockton and the help defense that the Jazz's positioning had left open by an increment that should not have been sufficient, and rose and released a mid-range floater that went through. Tied at 83. 46 seconds. The crowd adjusted. The noise continued, but the adjustment was audible to anyone in the building who had been paying attention to the crowd's sound as a real-time measurement of the game's emotional arithmetic. The Jazz had the ball. Malone received it in the post, the position from which he had generated 38 points and 20 rebounds in games 3 and 4, the position that the Jazz's offense had been designed around for 13 years, and the Delta Center crowd understood that the correct outcome, Malone converting, Utah maintaining the lead, the game moving toward its predetermined conclusion, was available in this possession. Phil Jackson called timeout. He told his players something. The timeout ended. Malone received the ball in the post again, and the crowd began its anticipation. What happened in the next 10 seconds is recorded in every archive that documents professional basketball. Jordan moved from behind Malone and stripped the ball from his hands, a steal executed at the junction of physical anticipation and timing precision, the strip arriving at the exact moment between Malone's receipt and Malone's preparation to score when the ball was most vulnerable. Jordan secured the possession. He dribbled up the right side of the floor with 25 seconds on the clock, and the Bulls trailing by 1, 86-85, Brian Russell assigned to defend him. He drove right. Russell committed to the right side. Jordan crossed back left, the crossover producing in Russell's body the specific false weight transfer that Jordan's crossover had been producing in defenders for 13 years, Russell's momentum going one direction while Jordan had already reversed to the other, and Jordan pulled up from 20 feet, a jump shot released from a platform of complete physical stillness at the top of the arc, and the ball left his hands, and the Delta Center had not yet processed the sequence, had not yet arrived at the moment of collective understanding that comes after an action, when the action's meaning becomes clear, and then the ball went through the net. Bulls 88, Jazz 86, 25 seconds. Jordan held his follow-through for a moment, not the extended held follow-through of a performer finishing a prepared statement, but the briefer, one of a man who has just done the specific thing his body was designed to do and is completing the mechanical action that the physics of the shot required. He turned and ran back toward defense. The Delta Center, which had spent 3 hours generating the specific sound of a crowd preparing to witness a championship, had gone silent. Not the theatrical silence of an arena performing Surprise, but the genuine silence of 19,000 people recalibrating simultaneously, the sound that results when an entire arena's prediction of the immediate future has just been revised. Stockton missed the first of 2 free throws. John Stockton, one of the best free throw shooters in the history of the game, missed the first of 2 free throws with 20 seconds left in a game his team needed to win. The Bulls held on, 90-88, and the arena that had been the loudest building in professional basketball for 3 hours went through its exits with the quiet of people who had assembled to receive something that had not been delivered. Jordan collapsed into Scottie Pippen's arms at the final buzzer. The image that has been reproduced more than any other from that night. Jordan's face pressed against Pippen's shoulder, Pippen's arm around him, Jordan's body communicating all the physical cost of what his decision to play had extracted, arrived as a statement about what was left in a body after it has been asked to perform at the highest level under conditions that should have made that level of performance impossible. Marv Albert on the broadcast said Jordan had almost played himself into passing out. Jordan said afterward that he couldn't breathe, that his energy was completely depleted, that he was nearly dehydrated, that he had scored 38 points in 44 minutes against one of the finest defensive systems in the history of the sport, with what he described, in the understated language of a man who had survived something he was still processing, as a mouth that was really dry. 38 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals, 1 block, 13 for 27 from the field, the game-winning three-pointer with 25 seconds remaining, on a body that had spent the previous 15 hours doing everything in its power to prevent him from being in that building. The Jazz players said afterward that he hadn't looked sick. Brian Russell, who had been assigned to Jordan in the final sequence, said Jordan sure didn't look sick. This was both true and a category error. He had looked sick, visibly and consistently sick, for all 44 minutes. The leaning on teammates, the towel over the head, the intervals on the bench, the slightly imprecise footwork, the dehydration visible in the quality of his movement by the fourth quarter. What Russell and the Jazz and the Delta Center crowd had seen was a man who was sick performing, as though the illness was a condition to be acknowledged and factored into the game plan, rather than a reason to recalibrate the ambition. The sickness was real. It was inside the performance rather than absent from it. The specific quality of what Jordan did on June 11, 1997, was not that he performed as though he was healthy. It was that he performed at the highest available level of his game, while the experience of serious physical illness was occurring in real time in his body, that the illness and the performance occupied the same body simultaneously, and the performance was the part he had decided was non-negotiable. Karl Malone sat at his locker after the game for a long time. He had scored 23 points and had a game-high 15 rebounds. He had done his job. The Jazz had gone up by 16 points in the first quarter of a home game in the NBA Finals, with their team's best player performing at the level that had won him the Most Valuable Player award 4 months earlier. The architecture had been correct. The materials had all been in place. The 986-957 margin, by which he had received the MVP votes over Jordan in February, had been validated by the game's first quarter and the first 3 minutes of the second. Then something had happened that the architecture hadn't accounted for, something that did not appear in any of the variables that the Jazz's preparation had identified as relevant. What had happened was not Jordan performing at his normal level. What had happened was Jordan performing at his available level, which on the night of June 11, 1997, in Salt Lake City, Utah, with his body severely compromised and the Delta Center crowd booing him through 44 continuous minutes, was still the highest level available in the building. The Bulls won the championship in 6 games, returning to Chicago for the closing. Malone and Stockton went back to Salt Lake City and did not win a title that year or in any subsequent year, both of them retiring without the championship that the summer of 1997 had brought within reach. The Jazz's perfect 10-0 home playoff record ended with Game 5. The Delta Center, which had spent 3 hours producing the specific noise of an arena certain of its outcome, produced the specific silence of an arena whose outcome has been altered by something it did not anticipate, and that silence was the last sound the season made in Salt Lake City. What Jordan carried out of that building was not, in the immediate sense, triumph. It was the knowledge, confirmed in a laboratory condition more rigorous than any the game normally provides, that the relationship between his body's condition and his capacity to compete at the highest level was not the relationship that applies to most people who have ever played the sport. For most players, physical illness at the level Jordan experienced on June 11th produces a specific outcome. The body's resources, redirected toward fighting the illness, are not available for athletic performance at the highest level. This is not a failure of will, it is physiology. What Jordan had demonstrated was that the version of this relationship that applies to him had different parameters than the version that applies to everyone else. The illness was real. The performance was real. And the gap between those two things, between what his body was experiencing and what his body was producing, was the measurement of something that went beyond preparation or talent or the standard competitive virtues that basketball culture celebrates. It was the measurement of a will that had been trained over 13 seasons to operate independently of the physical report that the body was providing. This is the principle that the flu game carries beyond the sport and beyond the specific evening in the Delta Center. There will be nights in any serious endeavor when the conditions are exactly wrong, when the body or the organization or the circumstances of the moment have arranged themselves in the configuration most hostile to the outcome you need to produce. The crowds that have gathered in your building, metaphorical and literal, will be booing. The scoreboard will be against you in the first quarter. The most obvious reading of the available evidence will suggest that tonight is not your night. What Jordan demonstrated on June 11, 1997, was not that will can eliminate the experience of difficulty. He was sick for 44 minutes. The difficulty was present and documented and visible to 19,000 people. What he demonstrated was that the presence of difficulty in a situation is not the same as the impossibility of performing within it, that between what a person is experiencing and what a person is capable of doing, there is a space, and that the size of that space is the only variable that actually matters when the crowd goes quiet.